Good day everyone. We are assigned to discuss to you the Chinese literature. I'm Generose de la Cruz and I'm going to present to you the introduction of the Chinese literature. China is the only country in the world with a literature written in one language for more than 3,000 consecutive years. This continuity results largely from the nature of written language itself. It is the use of characters, not letters as in Western languages, that is most important in the Chinese language. I mentioned a while ago that Chinese are using characters, not letters, because letter represents sounds. They spell out how words should be pronounced. Letters don't have any meaning by themselves, while a Chinese character, on the other hand, is more complex unit. Next, we have here the dominance of the written language. The dominance of the written language has significant effects on the development of literature. In handwriting or in print, a piece of literature has visual appeal. This has given rise to the great respect that calligraphy enjoys in China, where it has been regarded for at least 16 centuries as a fine art comparative to painting. It is simply because calligraphy was considered not just a form of decorative art, rather, it was viewed as the supreme visual art form wherein it was more valued than painting and sculpture, and ranked alongside poetry as means of self-expression and cultivation. So, we have here also the main disadvantage of written Chinese. The main disadvantage of written Chinese is the great number of characters it contains. Even basic reading and writing require a knowledge of more than 1,000 characters. But even with these disadvantages, Chinese has been a potent factor in shaping and maintaining a cultural continuity for millions of people. Chinese culture is important as it plays a significant role in defining every aspect of a Chinese individuals. These include the way individual conducts business, how one treats the family and the elders, how responsible are distributed in a family, and so forth. Next, it says here that China has a very old and rich tradition in literature and dramatic visual arts. Early writings generally derive from philosophical or religious essays, such as the works of Confucius and Lao Tzu. After the fall of dynasty, for example, a grand history of the late dynasty was commissioned and written by scholars in the next dynasty. To many Westerners, Chinese literature remains a hidden seam in the rich strata of Chinese culture. As a matter of fact, it is a treasure of a very considerable number of brilliant and profound works as each dynasty, in the long history of China, has passed down its legacy of magnificent events and works. For 3,500 years, they have woven a variety of genres and forms of encompassing poetry, essays, fiction, and drama. Chinese literature is the body of works written in Chinese, including the lyric poetry, historical and didactic writing, drama, and various forms of fiction. Chinese literature is one of the major literary heritages in the world, with an uninterrupted history of more than 3,000 years, dating back at least to the 14th century BCE. Its medium, the Chinese language, has retained its mysticable identity in both its spoken and written aspect in spite of generally gradual changes in pronunciation, the existence of regional and local dialects, and several stages in the structural representation of the written graphs or characters. Even in the partial or total conquest of China for considerable periods by non-Han Chinese ethnic groups from outside the Great Wall failed, to disrupt this continuity, for the conquerors were forced to adopt the written Chinese language as their official medium of communication because they had none of their own. So since the Chinese graphs were inherently non-phonetic, they were at best unsatisfactory tools for the transcription of the non-Chinese language, and attempts at creating a new alphabetical phonetic written language for empire building proved unsuccessful on the separate occasions. The result was that after a period of alien domination, the conquerors were culturally assimilated except the Mongols, who retreated en masse to their original homeland after the collapse of the Yuan or the Mongol dynasty in the year 1368. Thus, there was no disruption in China's literary development.
Now, I am Winnie Hernandez, who discuss the general characteristics. Through cultural contacts, Chinese literature has profoundly influenced the literary traditions of other Asian countries, particularly Korea, Japan, and Vietnam. Not only was the Chinese script adapted for the written language in these countries, but some writers adopted the Chinese language as their chief literary medium, at least before the 20th century. The graphic nature of the written aspect of Chinese language has produced a number of noteworthy effects upon Chinese literature and its diffusion. Number 1. Chinese literature, especially poetry, is recorded in handwriting or in print and purpose to make an aesthetic appeal and to reader that is visual as well as oral. Number 2. This visual appeal of the graphs has in fact given rise to the elevated status of calligraphy in China, where it has been regarded for at least the last 16 centuries as a fine art comparable to painting. Scrolls of calligraphic renderings of poems and prose selections have continued to be hung alongside paintings in homes of the common people as well as the elite, converting these literary gems into something to be enjoyed in everyday living. For number 3, on the negative side, such a writing system has been an impediment to education and the spread of literacy, thus reducing the number of readers of literature. For even a rudimentary level of reading and writing requires knowledge of more than 1,000 graphs together with their pronunciation. Number 4. On the other hand, the Chinese written language, even with its obvious disadvantages, has been a potent factor in perpetuating the cultural unity of the growing millions of the Chinese people, including assimilated groups in far-flung peripheral areas, different in function from recording words in alphabetic Phoenician language. The graphs are not primarily indicators of sounds and can therefore be pronounced in variant ways to accommodate geographical diversities in speech and historical phonological changes without damage to the meaning of the written page. As a result, the major dialects in China never developed into separate written languages as did the Romance languages. And although the reader of a Confucian classic in southern China might not understand the everyday speech of someone from the far north, Chinese literature has continued to be the common asset of the whole Han Chinese people. By the same token, the graphs of China could be utilized by speakers of other languages as their literary mediums. The pronunciation of the Chinese graphs has also influenced the development of Chinese literature. The fact that each graph had monophonic pronunciation in a given context created a large number of homonyms, which led to misunderstanding and confusion when spoken or read aloud without the aid of the graphs. One corrective was the introduction of tones or pitches in pronunciation. As a result, metre in Chinese prosody is not concerned with the combination of syllabic stresses, as in English, but with those asyllabic tones, which produce a different but equally pleasing cadence. This tonal feature of the Chinese language has brought about an intimate relationship between poetry and music in China. All major types of Chinese poetry were originally sung to the accompaniment of music. Even after the musical scores were lost, the poems were, as they still are, more often chanted in order to approximate singing than merely read. Chinese poetry, besides depending on end rhyme and tonal metre for its cadence, is characterized by its compactness and brevity. There are no epics of either folk or literary variety and hardly any narrative and descriptive poems that are long by the standards of world literature. Stressing the lyrical as often been pointed out, the Chinese poet refrains from being exhaustive, marking instead the heights of his ecstasies and inspiration or the depths or sorrow and sympathy. Generally, pronouns and conjunction are omitted, and one or two words often allude the highly complex thoughts or situations. This explains why many poems have been differently interpreted by learned commentators and competent translators. The line of demarcation between prose and poetry is much less distinctly drawn in Chinese literature than in other national literatures. This is clearly reflected in three genres. The Fu, for example, is on the borderline between poetry and prose, containing elements of both. It uses rhyme and metre and not infrequently also antithetic structure. But despite occasional flights into the realm of the poetic, another genre belonging to the category is pianwen, parallel prose, characterized by antithetic construction and balanced tonal patterns without the use of rhyme. The turn is suggestive of a theme of paired horses.
Let's move forward. Let's discuss the four books. The four books are traditionally attributed to Confucius. It has been established that he did not write a single word of them. They were written down by his students after his death. The first one is The Great Learning. Came from a chapter in the Classic of Rites from the Classics. Consists of a short main text attributed to the teachings of Confucius and then 10 commentary chapters accredited to one of Confucius' disciples. Guide for Moral Self-Cultivation. It states that the key to moral cultivation is learning or the investigation of things. Through the learning about things, one comes to understand the principle in all things, which allows them to better comprehend the world. Through this moral self-cultivation, one's li or principle and ki or psychophysical state are in harmony, leading to consistent moral behavior. The message would lead scholars to think of the value of their studies. The next one is the Analects. It is a collection of Confucius' teachings and discussions with his students and disciples. It includes 20 books, each generally featuring a series of chapters that encompass quotes from Confucius, which were compiled by his disciples after his death, emphasized learning as well as good governance, Virtue and Ritual. One of the most widely read and studied books in China for the last 2,000 years and continues to have great influence on Chinese and East Asian thought and values. The next one is the Mencius, a collection of conversations Mencius held with Confucius. Mencius places a strong emphasis on the responsibility of the emperor to practice good governance through following the way. Also believes that humans are inherently good. Emphasizes the idea that we are all born with righteousness and goodness, but must learn how to nurture and cultivate those traits. And the last one is the Doctrine of the Mean. The Doctrine of the Mean is attributed of Czi, Confucius' grandson, and deals with how to maintain perfect balance and harmony in one's life. It focuses on following the way and acting through what is right and natural, but also acknowledges the people often do not act properly. So, people are encouraged to engage in moral self-cultivation to act properly. Also emphasizes the fact that good governance relies on the men and that rulers who maintain balance are not only more effective but also encourage the way in others.
Let us move on to the 5 classics. And the first one is the Book of Documents. It is a compilation of 58 chapters about the events of ancient China. It tells the deeds of the early sage Kings Yao and Shun. It was also influential in developing an understanding of sage or person of profound wisdom. Also, it includes the history of the Xia, Shang, and Zhou dynasties, and is often considered the first recording of the history of ancient China. The Book of Odes, or also known as the Book of Songs or Book of Poetry. It consists of 305 poems dealing with a range of issues including love and marriage, agricultural concerns, daily lives, and war. It contains also the different categories of poems including folk songs and hymns used in sacrifice. It is believed that Confucius selected the 305 poems from a much larger collection. Next is the Book of Rites. It described the social norms, governmental organization, and ritual conduct during the Zhou dynasty. Believed to have been compiled by Confucius, it became the foundation of many ritual principles that arise in later imperial China. It states that proper ritual conduct would maintain harmony in the empire as well as emphasize the importance of piety. Next is the Book of Change. It contains a system of divination which is centered largely around the principles of yin and yang. It has the collection of linear signs to be used as oracles and some practices are still used to this day. They represented certain processes in nature corresponding with the character and the family member that had different meanings. And the last is the Spring and Autumn Annals. It was the longest of the 5 classics and the historical chronicle of the state of Lu. Appear to have been created specifically for analytic purposes. At first thought to be written by Confucius, but modern scholars believe that the text was actually written by various chronicles from the state of Lu.